Okay, we're live. So, welcome everyone to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Bollin. Today, we actually have a returning guest, and many of you should know him. He's Dr. Stephen Harper. He was on a while ago discussing issues vis-a-vis the first vision of Joseph Smith. And he actually has a nice picture of the sacred grove in the background. And as I showed him, I'm wearing my Joseph and Moroni t-shirt. So, the art of early LDS history is well represented today. But of course, like Dr. Harper, thanks for again agreeing to come onto this podcast. And I'm sure like many people already know who you are from your books, your articles, and your presentations. But just in case they do not know who you are, how about you give an introduction to yourself? Like, what's your education? What's your background in the church? What's your publication history? And also, what got you interested in writing a book on the Word of Wisdom and related issues as well?
All right, great. Well, I am the husband of Jennifer Sebring, and we're the parents of 5 children, and we, to our great delight, have a 2-year-old granddaughter, and that's the greatest blessing as our family. And we are graduates of BYU. We graduated in the same year in 1994, and she's sculpting right now in the next room as I speak. And she went into art education. I went into history, and then got graduate degrees in increasingly specific historical periods. So I went to Utah State for an MA in American history, and did a lot of reading in early modern Europe for that as well. And then to Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in the United States for a PhD in early America with minor emphases in early modern Europe and 19th century American religion, and but mostly focused on the colonial period of American history. And I did all of that with a great desire to teach the early history of the restored gospel, but I didn't know if that job would be available to me. So I also wanted to prepare to teach in a history department somewhere else, and also to study the world that gave us the restoration, right? Set the table for what happens in upstate New York and Ohio and Missouri. So worked out wonderfully well for me. Been teaching at BYU in the Department of Church History and Doctrine for couple of decades now, along with some other projects and assignments on the side, and I really love what you're doing, and I'm excited to be with you again to talk about the Word of Wisdom.
Thanks for that. Now, I think this is actually the very first publication of yours I ever came across, and this has been a number of years ago. It was your book in the Saying the Facts Right series. On the Word of Wisdom, and I actually really enjoyed it. And I got a number of the other volumes in the series, and some of them are good, like Brian Hales on fundamentalism and late Jesse Embry on Mormon polygamy. They're pretty good in the series as well. So, would you mind giving, like, say, some background information? It's like, who approached you to write this book on the Word of Wisdom? Did you have any historical interest in the development of the Word of Wisdom, and what was the story about the writing and researching the book itself?
Yeah, great question. So I got the invitation to write the book, which, if I had been making the invitation, I would have given it to Paul Peterson, who was our best scholar on the Word of Wisdom. I'd been studying and teaching Joseph Smith's Revelations for a long time. I know my way around the Word of Wisdom, but there are better scholars, including certainly Paul Peterson. But he had recently passed away from cancer. So the publisher invited me to do it, and I did. I was glad to do it. The assignment was just to do a small book. It's not very long, 30,000 or so words, and just to try to set the record straight. There's a lot of misunderstandings when it comes to the Word of Wisdom, even in the sort of new way we tell ourselves about the Word of Wisdom. You hear the emphasis a lot that, well, it wasn't a commandment at the first and kind of became a commandment over time. Even that's overly simple and doesn't really quite account for the facts of the matter very well. And so that's how I got interested in doing it. I kind of came to the assignment by accident, and I was grateful for Professor Peterson's work. I drew on it very heavily, as well as on the work of other scholars and primary research, of course, in the original documents.
That's good. So, of course, like today's topic is the word of wisdom. So, how about you first give us like how did the word of wisdom come about? What's the historical background to like Section 89? And it's kind of like an interesting topic because, of course, the church has made some changes to the heading of what is now
Right.
Section 89. So, like the background has been like in the forefront, if you will, of some discussions of the revelations as of late. So,
yeah, truly, I was delighted, as I assume you were, and your listeners will be, to hear just not long ago that some changes have been made to the headings in the Doctrine and Covenants, as well as a couple of chapters in the Book of Mormon. This is just to bring us up to speed, right? To update what we now know coming out of the Joseph Smith Papers Project and out of the Church History Department is always cutting edge research. And so the heading to Doctrine and Covenants Section 89 has just been updated, includes what we've got, but it especially now includes Emma Smith's contributions to the conversations that led to seeking and receiving this revelation. Probably a bunch of people will know that, according to David Whitmer, that Emma Smith complains about the filthy environment of the School of the Prophets. There are other sources too. Brigham Young is a key source where he tells about, filthy conditions, and Emma saying, shouldn't we do something about this? Is there something the Lord might have to say about this? There's no reason to doubt the general outline of that story, but it's a small story. It's a microcosmic story in a much bigger macro environment. And without that bigger environment, there's no word of wisdom revelation. There's no real need for a revelation. And so it's not just about tobacco use in the School of the Prophets. That's a approximate catalyst for the word of wisdom. But in Joseph Smith's time and place, one scholar called it in an important book, The Alcoholic Republic. Alcohol consumption is huge, much more than it is today, at least on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. So the issues are complex and varied, and the questions are by no means answered, meaning there are arguments and conversations and a wide variety of opinions on tobacco use, alcohol consumption, mustard, whether mustard will kill you or not, whether you should eat a watermelon or not, and if so, in what state of ripeness, and everything you could possibly ingest or eat, it seems, is sort of being debated. And it's not a whole lot different, frankly, from today. If you get on, right, any sort of social media or even YouTube, there's all kinds of people telling you what substances are going to kill you or what vitamins you absolutely have to have and so forth. And then as now people were selling stuff, and one of the major contributions of the word of wisdom is to say, be careful and beware of people who are selling you stuff and what their claims are. So the word of wisdom is a revelation into this much bigger and ongoing conversation about what's good for you. And then very importantly, it's part of a much bigger conversation, an ongoing conversation among religious people generally, and certainly throughout Christian history, about the role of the body, right? What's the body have to do with Christianity, or with our salvation, our eternal life? Many people, including at the time of the revelation, followers of Mother Ann Lee, or the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, They had decided that the body was just a burden, something to be jettisoned, right? Death, you can look forward to death, so you could be rid of this awful body with all of its temptations and shortcomings. And the word of wisdom goes a completely different direction from that line of thinking. The revelation immediately preceding it in the Doctrine and Covenants had given a definition of the soul as the spirit and the body. And certainly, Doctrine and Covenants 89 has as its basic principle that the body is important. The body is an important part of our soul, and taking good care of it, being a good steward of it, as well as of everything else, herbs, vegetables, beef, wild animals, domesticated animals, being good stewards of all those things is at the heart of the word of wisdom.
Well, thanks for that. Because you mentioned the temperance, you alluded to the U.S. temperance movement. Um, you know, how prevalent were they in Joseph Smith's time and he's the locale where Section 89 was received? And also, some critics like the Tanners and others claim that the word of wisdom can be explained almost whole cloth by borrowing from the temperance movement. So, are there like substantial or even accidental differences between what's discussed in the word of wisdom from what was the common view of the time of the various temperance movements?
Yeah, this is a great line of thought, Robert, a great set of questions. So there's no doubt whatsoever that the temperance movement, which for those who may not know, is an effort led primarily by Christian women, middling class kind of Christian women in America. It's one of many social movements to improve society, to improve health, to improve welfare. And there's no doubt that in the 1920s and then into the 1820s and into the 1830s, when the word of wisdom is revealed, that temperance is growing in, more and more people are paying attention. There are all kinds of ways to see this. So it would be silly to say temperance has nothing to do with the word of wisdom. But it's just as silly to say that because there's a context for revelation, it's not a real revelation. That's a non sequitur. That's a premise that does not logically follow, right? Joseph Smith never claimed to receive revelations that were out of the blue, that had nothing to do with the problems, questions, issues, concerns of the day. I don't know about you, but I don't even care about revelations like that. I care about the revelations that are answers to the pressing problems and questions that I have. So it's common for people to say, oh, yeah, he came up with baptism for the dead because he had people that he loved who had died without the gospel. That's silly. It's a fact that he had people he loved who died without the gospel. It doesn't follow that he made up the revelations that solved the long-standing soteriological problem of Christianity. Similarly, at least by the mid-1820s, there are temperance societies and meetings being held in close proximity to where Joseph Smith is. That's especially true in northeastern Ohio, where he moves in 1831, and where the word of wisdom will be given in 1833. But in other words, the question about should we be drinking, and if so, how much, how often, etc., those are questions that have been being asked in Joseph Smith's house by his parents, who disagree on that question for years before the word of wisdom. So having the questions and not having the answers is the very setting for the word of wisdom. It's not knowing what to do about tobacco use in its various forms. It's not knowing what to do about distilled alcoholic drinks as compared to fermented ones. It's not knowing for sure what to do about herbs and so forth. Those are the reasons for seeking and receiving more revelation.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. So And also, the current text of the Word of Wisdom, that is what is now section 89, the first few verses were not actually seemingly original to it. So would you mind, like, say, just discussing, like, say, the textual development, if you will, of what is now section 89? And also, do these additional texts indicate something about how it was understood or received at that time during Joseph Smith's period?
This is a fantastic question. Close readers will notice that you have a kind of a head note, and this was not unusual for many of the revelations of Joseph Smith. One of the best sources we have for these is the Book of Commandments and Revelations. And when we studied it closely in connection with the Joseph Smith papers and the publication of it, one of the things we noticed is that it was often the case that John Whitmer would write a little historical head note for the Revelation, just like we have our italicized historical headings today, right? He did that work sort of in the original iteration of it. And so we have this heading that says it's a word of wisdom for the benefit of the council of high priests and the saints assembled in Kirtland and in Zion to be sent greeting, not by commandment or constraint, by revelation, the word of wisdom. And this is the line that people often cite to say, this revelation wasn't originally given as a, thus saith the Lord, I demand that you do this, or thou shalt not ever touch a plug of tobacco, right? And it is the case that early saints understood it to mean, it's clear that Joseph Smith understands it to mean, not that if you take an alcoholic drink, God will open a fiery pit and drop you into it for all eternity. This sounds silly, but I actually grew up thinking that if I ever smoked a cigarette, it would be the equivalent of axe murdering my entire neighborhood. And my parents didn't ever say that. It's just the sort of look of horror my mom got on her face when she got any indication that I might ever do something like that. And the sternness with which she said things like, don't you ever touch a cigarette, right? So those kind of signals gave me, growing up sort of in the heart of Mormondom, they gave me this idea, this impression that violating the word of wisdom was evil. And then, of course, in the years since, I've studied a lot of things about it, and now I know from close readings of the Revelation, including reading the historical, the received history, the reception history of it, I should say. What did it mean to the earliest saints who received it? What did it mean in 1851, 61, 71? What has it meant over time until our very own time? And that reception history teaches us that the early saints don't receive it the way I did as a little kid. They don't think that drinking a glass of alcohol, a glass of beer, even a shot of whiskey is like murdering someone. They don't make that equivalent. Now, to be clear, there are teetotalers among them. There are people who are very devoted temperance crusaders and so forth, but that's not the mainstream of the group of Latter-day Saints. It's also the case that there are drunks among them, that there are folks who excessively use tobacco, alcohol, etc. And neither of those extremes sort of characterizes the mainstream of the church. In some ways, Emma and Joseph are good. They're characteristic of the mainstream of the church in the 1830s. Emma takes tea. Joseph says in his own history that he drank. He drank when he was translating the Book of Mormon, not like right while he's doing it necessarily, but during that period. Martin Harris thought maybe he did it excessively, and Joseph candidly has that kind of conversation right in his history about it. And there are clear records. There are records, there are notes of a sermon he gave in 1841, where he started the sermon by saying, "Would you like to know what my temptations are?" What a hook, right? What a great way to get me to be riveted to what he's going to say next. He said, "Women are not my temptation. Whiskey, whiskey, whiskey. That's my temptation. If the Lord did not forbid it, I would grow fat on it. I would not wrestle with it because I could not throw it. So the early saints don't think of these substances as the devil itself. They think of them as inanimate objects. In other words, alcohol, tobacco, herbs, they don't have agency. And the revelation is about the agency of Latter-day Saints. Even the weakest among them can make choices relative to these substances. And that's, I think, the best way to characterize it. I think we think of the word of wisdom as a litmus test, and certainly it's become that. There are reasons for that. There are sociology of religion reasons why the word of wisdom has become kind of the boundary that it has become for us. And there are also good practical temporal salvation reasons for that. But those were not necessarily reasons that motivated or meant anything to the earliest Latter-day Saints.
Now, some have actually charged Joseph Smith and some early Latter-day Saints of his period of hypocrisy. For instance, they claimed there were charges, especially during the Far West period, of people being disfellowshipped or excommunicated for breaking the word of wisdom and so forth. So, how strict was the enforcement of the word of wisdom, however understood, during Joseph Smith's period of time? And do you believe that there was any growth and development in how it should be understood, even during his period, even before the Brigham Young period?
Yeah, most definitely. We could give a high-level overview of that history. It goes like this. The receipt of the revelation in February 1833 in the School of the Prophets or adjacent to it. And then the question becomes, so what kind of a test, if any, of fellowship is required by the word of wisdom? In other words, how faithful do we have to be to the letter of that text in order to be Latter-day Saints? And so an early test of that question happens in 1834, so just the year after the revelation. By now we have a stake of Zion in Kirtland, Ohio, and Joseph Smith is the stake president. And we have in section 102 of the Doctrine and Covenants very detailed instructions for how a stake council will adjudicate questions of fellowship, for example, in the church. And we have some missionaries recently returned from Pennsylvania, and they bring a report and to Joseph Smith and the state council where they say, look, we were out in Pennsylvania and we were trying to help them understand the word of wisdom. And we noticed that there were people in that branch of the church who were blessing the sacrament and breaking the word of wisdom. And so what do we do? What do we do? And the church doesn't know the answer to this question. So the state council takes it up. And what they decide is that anyone in an official position, anyone with responsibilities, for example, of officiating in the sacrament or leading a branch, if they have been taught the word of wisdom, then they should comply with it. And if they don't, they should not officiate in that calling. Now, what I think might interest people is that original decision has remained in place ever since. Nothing has changed since 1834 about the idea that if you're a leader in the church, you should obey the word of wisdom. And if you don't, you shouldn't be a leader in the church. Now, people might say, no way, that can't possibly be true, that that's remained the same, because I know of this example and that example. But it's important to just differentiate. The thing that has changed is not the policy. The thing that has changed is what it means to obey the word of wisdom, right? So in the earliest days of the church, you're okay with the word of wisdom if you, generally speaking, are avoiding drunkenness, avoiding abuse of these substances, right? Nobody's going to get too terribly picky. Well, a few people on the very edge of real strict enforcement might, but not the mainstream leadership of the church. Joseph Smith won't get on your case If you have a beer, he might get on your case if you're fall down drunk and not looking after your kids very well as a result, right? Does that make sense? So obey, what it means to obey, what it means to be faithful to the word of wisdom, that has changed a lot over the history of it. But the idea that you should be faithful to it if you know it and are called to lead and serve in the church, that has not changed since year one of interpreting and applying the word of wisdom.
Cool. Well, we have a storm, so hopefully you won't hear it too much in the background. But from, of course, like after Joseph was killed in 1844, Brigham would take over from
Right.
his role as president of the church. And there was actually quite a number of developments and attempts to make into a commandment, if you will, the word of wisdom. Some point to say 1851 and the 1870s in various movements. So could you give like an overview, like say Brigham Young's own attitude towards the word of wisdom and the various attempts to like make it more strict, if you will, during his presidency? And why do you think why do you think they never actually succeeded in making it into a commandment in that kind of generation as well?
Well, I think that there are lots of reasons for that, and some somewhat complex ones. In some ways, it has relative importance. And again, let's introduce this sociological concept of boundary making and boundary maintenance. So I believe the word of wisdom was a revelation from God. I'm not trying to say otherwise, but I'm going to get a little academic in saying it also, one of the things it does is creates distinction. What is distinctive about the Latter-day Saints? What can they offer the world that isn't everywhere else, right? And one of the answers to that is the word of wisdom. But in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it was by far not even close to the most important, not on the top 10 list of distinctive things about the Latter-day Saints, right? The Book of Mormon was number one distinctive. It was a massive, massive differentiator in Protestant North America and in the Isles. The main difference makers, the main things that were boundaries between the restored gospel and the unrestored gospel, you would have gone way down that list before you got to Word of Wisdom. Nowadays, you're not very far down that list before Word of Wisdom comes up, right? Word of Wisdom is a main differentiator today between Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints. It's one of the things that many people know if they don't know anything else. And it's one of the weird things, or one of the distinguishing features. So the question in some ways that you're asking is, how did we get from there to here? So in the 1840s and 50s, when Brigham Young is leading the church, he is not very concerned about whether the saints are faithful to the word of wisdom. He has bigger problems, in other words, lots bigger problems. And the biggest one is how to get the saints safely out of a hostile country and to a place far away in the West where they can prosper and be free. And on the way to that place, they pack their wagons and their hand carts with as much tea and coffee as they can. I don't know or understand all the reasons or the complexities, but one thing that's going on there, it seems to me, is when you don't possibly have enough food to nourish everybody, enough calories to go around, you supplement that with caffeine. And this, I mean, we do this today. So that's one of the things that's going on. You might think, some people might think today, well, I can't believe they did that. How wicked. But those people would be having a similar problem that I did as a kid, thinking that disobedience to the word of wisdom is evil, not just unwise, right? There's nothing in the Revelation where the Lord says, I consider you wicked if you have a cigarette. He's just saying it's not very wise. It's not. I've made all these substances for you to use, and it would be unwise for you to use them for uses that could rob your agency or make you sick. That's what the word of wisdom is. So we might misunderstand the people of the past. We might think they were too lax or too unfaithful, when really the problem would be we're not understanding the revelation very well still in in the 21st century. We may not be hearing what the Lord is actually saying. So Brigham Young did not worry if saints had a bottle of wine in their wagon, or a whiskey, or a bunch of tobacco, or whatever, coffee and tea. He's got tobacco. He's going to use tobacco up until the early 1860s. Now, we also would be making a mistake if we thought, so this doesn't matter at all to Brigham Young. He doesn't even care about the word of wisdom. That's not true. As you mentioned, in 1851, he makes it a point of saying to the general membership of the church, don't you think we ought to kind of raise the bar on the word of wisdom? Everybody raise your hand if you're going to be faithful to the word of wisdom from here on out. And everybody says, you bet. That's 1851. And Brigham Young himself is going to struggle for another decade with a tobacco chewing habit. When he finally kicks that in the early 1860s, he does a similar kind of thing again. He kind of ramps it up. He puts some emphasis on it. He jokes about it. They all know that he's had his own struggles. And so he tells a funny joke about somebody who asked their doctor, would it cause brain damage if I were to use tobacco? And Brigham Young says, the doctor says, there's no possible way that tobacco use can cause brain damage, because anyone who has a brain will not use tobacco. And he tells that joke knowing that they all know that he's been struggling, for his whole life with a tobacco habit. So that's the way it goes. The saints know it's important. They value the word of wisdom. They believe it's revelation from God, but they also struggle. All of them in some way or other are struggling with something. And for many of them, that's a substance that's got addictive properties. And so they wrestle along with that and overcome the best they can. And they don't make it more than it is, and they don't make it less than it is. And that's really the way it goes until the stakes are raised early in the 20th century. And the stakes are raised largely because of what the Revelation foretold. Verse 4 might be the most important verse in the Revelation. It says, "Thus saith the Lord unto you, in consequence of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days, I have warned you, and I am forewarning you by giving you this word of wisdom by revelation." So in the 1830s, 40s, etc., there were no people manipulating the levels of nicotine in tobacco. There were people making massive amounts of whiskey or whatever else and selling it. There were people farming tobacco and selling it, but they weren't yet conspiring to get people addicted to it and then to replace the ones they knew it would kill when they did. That's going to come along in the mid 20th century. And in response to that, in preparation for that, President Heber J. Grant will really quite consistently and faithfully sort of raise the stakes on the Latter-day Saints and help them understand it's time for us to commit more faithfully and fully to the word of wisdom. And that includes a course of a couple of world wars where tobacco use skyrockets among many populations. So just as you've got misuse of these things God has created for legitimate uses, right? There are legitimate uses for distilled drinks, or at least distilled alcohol, and fermented alcohol, and for tobacco, right? The word of wisdom emphasizes there's right ways to use all this stuff, and there are bad ways to use it. The wise thing to do would be to use them with judgment and skill, and with gratitude, and in the ways that the Lord has intended and prescribed. So President Grant is going to be our most important prophet, really, I think, when it comes to the word of wisdom. He's going to provide the inspired leadership that's going to take us from what the revelation meant in its original context to the fulfillment of the forewarning the Lord gives us in verse 4. I'm telling you, in the latter days, there are going to be conspirators who manipulate the levels of nicotine in their products, precisely because they know how addictive it is and how deadly it is. And in advance of that, President Grant already had us, you know, laser focused on a higher standard, which eventually becomes no alcohol, no tobacco in any form, no coffee or tea. And of course, then later we add no illicit drugs, which is not at all mentioned in the Word of Wisdom. I remember listening to President Hinckley years ago. This had to be in the mid 1980s. He gave a conference talk and he said, I keep hearing from some people saying, hey, the Word of Wisdom doesn't explicitly forbid cocaine or whatever. And he said, yeah, it also doesn't say don't jump off an overpass or into an empty swimming pool either, but who doubts the deadly consequence of that? He was exasperated by how much of a proof texting group we've become when it comes to the Word of Wisdom. We sometimes miss the mark of that revelation by essentially asking, what's the bare minimum I have to do to comply? What's the the least I have to do to please God by obeying the Word of Wisdom? That's a wrong way to think about it. The Word of Wisdom is a love note from Heavenly Father who says, I made you, I made your bodies, I made your spirit, I made all this great stuff. Let me give you a few pointers, a few pieces of advice about how to use the great stuff for maximum benefit. And if you do, there are these spectacular contingent blessings, including knowledge you can't get in any other way. Hidden treasures of knowledge that you'll never have unless you choose to comply with using the stewardships I've made for you with the agency you've got in the way I prescribe. There's knowledge to be gained in that way that's not available any other way. So we've come to a higher standard of Word of Wisdom faithfulness, but I think, frankly, there's a whole lot of still really missing the mark. When we debate exactly how many milligrams of this or that we can have without violating the words, we are missing the mark entirely.
Well, thanks for that. And you kind of mentioned like President Grant, of course. It was during his presidency that our modern understanding of keeping the Word of Wisdom, if you will, became a prerequisite to hold a temple recommend and other issues as well. So would you mind, like, say, just giving, like, say, going into a bit more detail, it's like, why did President Grant actually see it necessary to elevate, if you will, the Word of Wisdom to be like status of these then and even today?
It's a great question. I don't really know for sure. Jed Woodworth would be best to answer this question. He's our best expert on what goes on inside the mind of Heber J. Grant. So I don't know what exactly President Grant is thinking all the time, why he's doing what he's doing. What I see, though, is I think the work that God is doing through President Grant. And that work is to get people like me, right? I have ancestors who were alcoholics. And for all I know, so am I. But I've never had to bear the heavy burden of that because I've never touched the stuff. Because President Grant in the early 1900s ramped up the Word of Wisdom in such a way so that my parents taught it to me in a way that Brigham Young never had it from his parents, nor even my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was sealed in the temple and perfectly worthily in the 1880s in Logan. And then over time, he becomes a casualty of President Grant raising the bar on the Word of Wisdom, right? Without changing his behavior any, my great-grandfather becomes unworthy of his temple recommend and has a very difficult, and in some ways a tragic life. Dies from liver failure, probably because of his alcohol abuse, as a relatively young man. And so the point of this is to say, I guess, that I am thrilled and thankful for the Word of Wisdom, and even including, especially for President Grant, interpreting it and applying it in a new way, right, over time, because that has spared me a lot of trouble. But I also recognize that there were people then, and then there are people now who find themselves maybe on the outside of a temple because they struggle with this habit or that one. So I'm not saying it was the wrong thing to do to sort of raise that bar, but there have been casualties as a result of that, and people who struggled mightily and found themselves, worthy of a temple recommend in the 1880s and then not in the 1930s. And that's an important part of the story. I trust in a God who ultimately makes all that right, who is going to help my great grandfather overcome his alcoholism and so forth.
Cool. Now, in recent times, there's been like some developments, if you will, in terms of say the word of wisdom, like addressing like issues that may not have been understood or like foreseen, like iced tea and so forth. So, do you want to give like an overview of that and like say, do you have like any idea like other topics the church might actually come and make decisions upon as well in the near future? I know that's a bit speculative, but
Yeah. So, every once in a while the church will weigh in. There have been a few church magazine articles on energy drinks and so forth, but the mode for most of our history of our leaders has been to not get clinical about stuff. It's to teach the principle. This was true in 1917 when Coca-Cola appealed to President Grant and said, "Hey, what about us?" I mean, some Latter-day Saints are saying no Coke because of caffeine or whatever else. And the decision of the church then was to say, we're not going to weigh in on every product on the shelf. We're going to teach these true principles and people will govern themselves. And so that was as far as I know, that was sort of the first iteration of the caffeine question. And then it goes on to this day. In 2017, the week that the church acquired the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon, I was so excited to talk about that in class on campus at BYU. I thought everybody would be interested. And it turns out that the news that everybody was interested in was in BYU sort of capitulating and saying, okay, fine, we'll sell caffeinated drinks on campus. The demand is so high. What the heck? So the church, and I'm grateful for this, does not develop a long list of how many micrograms of whatever substance you can have and still please God, or vice versa. It says, here are some true, beautiful principles. We are children of God, created in the image of heavenly parents. They made our spirits and our bodies to function wonderfully well together. And in mortality, they don't always function wonderfully well. They've got all kinds of challenges. And not only did they make us, they made the birds, right? The animals, the leaves on the trees. They made photosynthesis and they made the running water. And what they have to say by way of advice about using all the beautiful things they made specifically for our bodies is section 89, the doctrines. It's not everything God could ever tell us about how to take good care of ourselves. It's a few things, and really, in some ways specific to a couple of contexts. One, the 1830s questions about substances that are growing out of the temperance movement and related issues. But also, and interestingly, what I think is the most interesting thing about the word of wisdom, the other context is the conspiring people in the latter days who are trying to sell our kids substances that will addict them, undermine their agency, maybe ruin their lives or the lives of others. The Lord weighs in his wonderfully prescient, prophetic way here and says, I'm giving you a forewarning because of those evils and designs that will exist in the future. So that's the takeaway, right? What are the true principles that we should understand about being wise with our bodies and with the substances the material world that we have to live in. And then thank God for his love, for forewarning us, for giving us intelligence in advance. None of this makes us do anything. You sometimes see the t-shirt or the bumper sticker, I can't, I'm a Mormon. The word of wisdom doesn't make anybody not drink, right? The word of wisdom doesn't make anybody not vape. You can do whatever you want. I think some people sometimes resent it when God tells them it will be bad for you if you do this. It will be good for you if you do that. And really all God is doing when by revealing things like this is just sending us love notes. I love you, therefore I'm going to help you see what dangers you could avoid by knowing in advance that you should never put a cigarette in your lips.
Okay, well, there's a couple of other things. Now, of course, any discussion of the word of wisdom, so maybe like to say sorry, not sorry, but I'm sure some people who will be watching this will actually ask. So might as well deal with it now than in the comments. The comma issue. Basically, in verse 13, there's the comma introducing the 1921 printing, and it's pleasing unto me that they should not be used, comma, only in times of winter, or of cold, or of famine. Now, Interpreter she had an interesting article over a decade ago by A. Jane Birch, questioning the comma in verse 13 in the Word of Wisdom, where she addresses the so-called errant comma theory. So, do you have any take of your own on, like, say, the comma? Do you believe it should not be there? Do you believe it actually does affect potential meaning, or do you believe this is a bit of a nothing burger, as the kids would say?
Yeah, it's a great question. Very cool one. So I have very strong view on this. What I don't know is sort of the intent, if there was any intent on the placement of the comma. But so I don't know. But what I do know is the original intent of the revelation. There's no doubt about it at all. That the revelation means, let's read verse 13. Let's go back to 12. Yea, flesh also of beasts and of the fowls of the air, I, the Lord, have ordained for the use of man. So the revelation is about use and abuse of different substances. With thanksgiving, nevertheless, the they is flesh of beasts and fowls of the air, are to be used sparingly. And it's pleasing to me that they should not be used only in times of winter or of cold or famine. That means, in Joseph Smith's language, it's pleasing to the Lord that those things should be used sparingly and as needed in times of winter, cold, or famine. Right? It could be read to mean they should be used all the time, every time, abundantly, to excess. That's not what it means. It means, and its original meaning was clear to the earliest saints, it's pleasing to God, right? He doesn't say, I hate you if you don't do it my way or anything like that. He says, it would please me if you use this stuff for what I created it for. And it would please me if you used it when you needed it desperately or more desperately, winter, cold, or famine. I hope that makes sense. I've heard it taught otherwise, and it is sickening to me when it's taught wrong. It is clearly misrepresenting the original intent to.
Yeah, and I know like Talmage and some others have addressed that as well.
Yeah.
No, that's good. As I said, like it always comes up, so might as well like discuss it here as well. So there's we did actually have a good question that was submitted, and it's kind of apropos in light of say Heber J. Grant and elevating the word of wisdom. So might as well have your thought. He asks, given the expanded importance of the word of wisdom to be part of the temple recommend question, would that make the word of wisdom a covenant that we make with God?
I wouldn't say it's some sort of separate covenant. I'd say it's part of God's covenant with us, right? This is as old as Adam and Eve. It's as old as the oldest parts of the Old Testament, and it's as recent as our latest General Conference. God loves us, so God covenants with us. He wants a relationship with us. And that relationship is based on him saying, I promise you that I will do everything I can to bring you back to my presence. You don't have to come back. I won't force you back, but I will get rid of every single roadblock, every obstacle that keeps us separated from each other. And that promise and the covenants and ordinances and laws that go with it, we call that the new and everlasting covenant. And so a big part of that is that God has said to us, let me tell you some things that will make you sick, or that will undermine your soul, or that could compromise your agency. Let me tell you that that knowledge you want, that knowledge of me and of the secret, no, not secret in the sense that nobody can get it, but that knowledge that you can only get by obeying the laws of God. He says there's a part of that that's available for obeying the word of wisdom that you can't get some other way. So that's how the word of wisdom fits in our covenant with God, in the new and everlasting covenant. It's him using his complete all knowledge to enable us to be better, wiser agents, and someone with the power to act for myself. I can act more fully and more informedly if I know the word of wisdom than if I didn't know it, right? And it's also him telling us not only how to act as a free agent, but how to be a steward over the things he's given us to act upon, right? You're not really a free agent if you can act, but there's nothing really to act upon. No, it doesn't make any difference how you act. Well, there are several things listed in the word of wisdom. It makes a difference how you act upon let's take tobacco. If you use tobacco to treat bruises and sick cattle, wise. If you use tobacco to overcome stress and anxiety by ingesting it, that's not good for you. It's not wise, right? That's what the word of wisdom does. And so it's part of God's covenant love, his hesed, his covenant faithfulness. It's not itself some sort of separate or distinct covenant, but it's covenantal for sure, and it belongs to the new and everlasting covenant.
Thank you for that. Now, I did announce beforehand that I would actually have you on, and I belong to this group that has like currently serving missionaries or recently returned missionaries, and they submitted a couple of questions, and I think we kind of substantially answered them during this interview. But there's like two or three maybe we could deal with.
Right.
The first is like, how closely have different shifts in focus on the word of wisdom over the years matched broader trends in society? Like one example that comes to mind would be like, say, the temperate prohibition in 20th century America. I know President Grant was actually very much in favor of that. So do you think, like, say, of course, like the church is not like this, it exists in the vacuum, it exists like in the world. So of course it can be affected. So how much do you think, like, say, society and trends in society have caused the church to reflect upon and develop, if you will, the word of wisdom and its understanding?
This is a really great question, but I don't have a really great answer to it. I'm not informed enough about sort of global trends to give an informed answer. So all I could say is a sort of a highly qualified answer. And that is to say that if you looked into it closely, you could find ways that the word of wisdom has mapped on or been informed by or even informed policies and so forth. And you could also find plenty of evidence that the world cares nothing for the word of wisdom, and trends have gone, wherever they go, and has no regard whatsoever to the word of wisdom. I think in many areas of the world, probably where you're at and elsewhere, where I live, the laws are tougher. It's harder to get maybe some substances, but everywhere, including Provo, Utah, you could find within not very long your way to any of the substances that are prohibited and illicit drugs, illegal drugs, and so forth. So the trend of the world has been to do whatever will sell, right? Evils and designs in the hearts of conspiring men. People will sell drugs, they'll sell alcohol, they'll sell tobacco, and they will manipulate the levels of nicotine so they're optimally addictive, so that they can get people not just to do it once, but to have to do it every day until they're dead. And then they'll find ways to market to kids so that they can get them addicted early, so that they can replace the market that they're killing. So the world has gone its own way for evil intentions, and that includes people who will sell anything, and they don't care if it makes you sick. And that goes all the way from junk food to fentanyl to tobacco or whatever. So I know that's an unsatisfying answer. It's a really good question, and we ought to listen to people who could answer it in a better way than I can. But that's what I'd say about it. President Grant was frustrated for sure with the Latter-day Saints when they did not uphold the United States constitutional amendment on prohibition. It didn't last long. It was the most disobeyed law in American history, probably, is no manufacture or sale of alcoholic drinks. And Latter-day Saints themselves did not uphold it particularly well.
Yeah. Okay, and I think we addressed this more or less, but might just get your own opinion on this. Why do you think people care so much about the possibility of the word of wisdom changing someday? Because it seems like, say, the lead up to, say, either every general conference or every second general conference, there's a social media buzz, coffees can be allowable someday,
right.
Or they're going to make us vegetarians, they'll stress the meat stuff. So what do you think there's this, so many people in and out of the church are kind of obsessed with this kind of possibility, which I think is really remote anyway. But
yeah, I don't think the text is going to change in any material way. If so, it would be to make it more historically accurate, right? If we found that the text we have is not, we did this with the Book of Mormon. We've made adjustments to it to make it more faithful to the earliest text. So the text of Doctrine and Covenants 89 is not going to be changed 6 months from now to say, yeah, it's okay, cocaine is perfectly fine. Or even, I don't think they'll even say, yeah, everybody drinks caffeine, we might as well license that. So I think that's just a conversation topic, something to buzz about. So what I do think will happen is that the prophets will continue to weigh in on the principles. Whenever the enduring principles confront a new sort of dynamic, that's when we look to them and say, well, what about this? What about vaping? What about energy drinks? And in those cases, what they'll likely do for us is point us back to the enduring principles and say, govern yourselves based on wise and true principles. And as a reminder of what those are, fundamentally, that we are created in the image of God, and that our spirit and our body is a soul. Our body is not, it's sacred. It's not just, clay that's going to die someday and never have an eternal existence. Our bodies are an important part of our soul. And agency, right? Doctrine and Covenants section 101 says that God gave all of his children moral agency so they could act for themselves, so that they could be accountable. And he says there, it's abominable for anybody to take someone else's agency from them. God endowed us with agency. So you'll notice that the principles of the word of wisdom are based on the proscriptions, the do this, don't do that. They're based on those two fundamental truths that are not going to go anywhere. We're created in God's image with a body that's important, and we have agency in ourselves to decide how to act. So the word of wisdom can be distilled into a set of instructions about how to act with the stuff God has given us to act upon, based on the truth that our body is divine and our agency is a gift from God. And so are the milk drinks and the goats and the barley and the tobacco. All those things are gifts from God that should be used with thanksgiving. Some things should be used sparingly, right? Because that's the wise thing to do. Some things should only be used at certain times of the year. Some things you should wash the outside of your body with, but not your esophagus. Right? That's what the word of wisdom tells us how to do. I think it's maybe fun, but missing the mark to debate, if the prophets are finally going to cave in on this, or are they going to put a hard line on that? Are they going to limit my ice cream consumption? And if so, will I stay in the church or not? I'm not.
I don't know if they limit
much sleep over that.
I know, but if they limit like Dr. Pepper usage, I think like Utah will riot.
There could be a mutiny here. Yeah, there could be one in my house. Yeah.
No, that's good. So as we end, alongside your book in the Second Record Straight series, do you have like any other recommended books or articles that you found useful on either the word of wisdom in general or specific topics? One that comes to mind, which is for free anyway, Michael Ash, he's Up in Smoke article that was a response to the Tanners chapter in Shadow Reality. It's very well done. But any other recommended articles? I know that there's some by Thomas Alexander and a few others. So any that you would recommend to those who want to delve more into this text and its development?
Yeah, terrific question. That's what I would recommend is Professor Alexander's book. Help me with the title. It's the Church
Mormonism
in the Early
Transition.
Yeah, Mormonism in Transition. That one's terrific on Word of Wisdom, especially this period of, major reapplication of the Word of Wisdom at different, and I think you used the word enlarged. That's a good word for it. I really like Paul Peterson's work. He's got an MA thesis, as I recall, but probably more important than that is a BYU Studies article on Brigham Young and the Word of Wisdom, which is terrific. That one's free, accessible at byustudies.byu.edu. The stuff you mentioned, I can't think of. I'm in favor of people paying attention to good experts on how to take good care of your body and what substances are good and what others. But one of the principles for the Word of Wisdom is beware that there are evil designing people out there. And there are people selling then and now anything and everything that they can use to make money off of. And that includes vitamins that have no benefit and 1,000 things, right? That you could feel all this pressure. If you were really a good agent and a good steward of your body, then you would buy this supplement and that thing over there. And, one of the great things about the Word of Wisdom is it's pretty basic. I think I would encourage people, especially people who are inclined to go after every fad or fashion or feel like they're not being righteous unless they're paying lots of money for this latest fad or that. The Word of Wisdom could help us be reoriented and say it's pretty basic. And most important is the spirit, right? The body's important, but the spiritual blessings at the end are more than the Word of Wisdom. In other words, if we obey the Word of Wisdom because we think it might give us 16 more years of life, we're probably missing the point. Paul Peterson obeyed the Word of Wisdom as well as anybody I've ever seen in my life, and he died relatively young of cancer. We might think, well, he missed out, right? Here's a proof that the Word of Wisdom isn't real revelation. If he were here, he'd say, you don't know what I know. I know that there are things, wisdom and great treasures of knowledge, even hidden treasures, that you cannot have unless you obey the Word of Wisdom. And people who obey the Word of Wisdom know that, and the people who don't know it, and they don't know what they don't know because they have chosen not to obey the Word of Wisdom.
Perfect. Thanks for that. And are you working on any articles or projects that you'd be willing to share with us? And also any other resources you think would be useful? Something tells me you're a fan of BYU studies for some reason, but so any of that before we wrap things up?
Yeah. Make sure everybody knows that BYU Studies exists. It's a terrific periodical, scholarly stuff, but it's also informed by the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. So perspectives from Latter-day Saints and others, but that are compatible with and informed by the gospel. And it's all free. It's available at byustudies.byu.edu. There are lots of other great things out there, including your work, Robert, which I really
Thanks for
appreciate.
that.
And there are, as far as what I'm doing, I'm working now on a manuscript on the Doctrine and Covenants to be a book. And it's aimed primarily at non-Latter-day Saints. It's for college students. It's part of a series of books called Studies in Sacred Texts. And my sacred text is the Doctrine and Covenants. So I'm having a lot of fun being challenged by the daunting task of writing for non-Latter-day Saints in a way that will help them understand what the Doctrine and Covenants means to people like me who hold it sacred. I don't expect that I will convince anybody to change their mind. The people who are going to read this book or be assigned to read the book are people who take religion seriously, but not necessarily at face value. So they're going to be reading a book about revelations from Jesus Christ to Joseph Smith, and they're going to think, I understand that Joseph Smith and his followers believe these were revelations from Christ, but I don't necessarily believe that. Their default setting, most of them, is to be quite skeptical of those kinds of claims. I understand that. What I hope will happen from reading the book is not necessarily conversion, but that they would say, I now understand why Latter-day Saints would think these are real revelations from Jesus Christ. That's my project right now. It's kind of fun. It's really fun, although there are days when it's overwhelming and difficult.
And any ETAs to when that may be published?
I've got a 2-year fellowship to get it done, and I hope that will include not only the time to finish writing it, but get it into production as well. So a couple of years.
Oh, that's good. No, I'll look forward to it because I'm actually a fan of your making sense of the Doctrine and Covenants. I've said it before, like there's not that many good commentaries on the Doctrine and Covenants. You had like Sodell, his commentary with Hiram Smith and a few others, the 4-volume work by Robinson, and the other fellow, I forget his name at the moment, and your commentary, and also your 1-volume commentary, which is really good as well. But there's not that many out there, so hopefully that will add to the recommended D&C list I can have. So I look forward to that.
I hope so. Thank you.
My pleasure. Well, again, Dr. Harper, thank you again for your time. Really do appreciate not just your work on the Word of Wisdom, but everything else you do, particularly the First Vision materials you've done. So, keep up the great work, and hopefully we can actually have you on in the podcast again, maybe when the book comes out or whenever. So, but thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thanks. Be well. Talk to you again soon.